So, hello, fools. I think we're often sold a lie about success. We're told it's a straight line. You have your Ivy League schools, your perfect networks, and a steady climb up the corporate ladder. But my guest today proves that the most durable success is the kind that survives revolutions, recessions, and life-threatening illnesses, and is born from something that's much darker and much more beautiful. So, Shirin Behzadi arrived in this country at 17 years old. She had no parents here. She had no money. She spent her nights in a bulletproof glass booth at a gas station, working the graveyard shift while the rest of the world slept. So from that glass booth, she didn't just survive. She went on to become the CEO of Home Franchise Concepts, transforming it into a billion-dollar enterprise. She joins me today to discuss her new book, The Unexpected CEO, My Journey from Gas Station Cashier to Billion-Dollar CEO. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I love that introduction. You're
Yeah,
so
yeah.
right.
Yeah, after I read this book, I was so inspired. So I'm really excited about the conversation today. And
I
I
love
want to
it.
start taking back to the beginning. You wrote something in your book that really kind of caught my eyes. You said I didn't know it then, but I essentially lost my precious life when I left Iran. That kind of sounds like grief. It sounds like death. But can you take me back to like that 17-year-old girl who had to leave her family behind, and kind of like what did she actually lose in that moment?
That's a very thought-provoking question. I had been born and raised in Iran to a very loving family, and life was very normal until the revolution happened, which was very chaotic. So, really understood that safety was not something I could rely on anymore because of all of the chaos and everything that we witnessed. In fact, I was arrested twice as a
Wow.
teenager. Once I was just walking on the street and I guess they didn't like the way I looked. And the second time I owned a book and they found it, which is very interesting because now I wrote a book, which
Yeah.
quite interesting. With all of that and with all of the lack of opportunity at the time because of war, my parents decided that in order for me to build a life that it was time for me to leave. But here's the catch, I'm the youngest of five. I had lots of friends and family around and I was to leave all of that behind, including my parents, to find a new life. And so when I left, at the time I was so confused. I wasn't exactly sure what I was doing. Obviously, I was 17, but and when I landed in Turkey, when I first arrived in Turkey, which is where I stayed for a while, I had no family, I had very little money, I had no guidance, had never been away from home. And upon reflection, I think there was a fork in the road, which was succumb to all of it and assume that was my life, or bring hope into the picture. And that's what I did. I opted in for hope. I opted in to say, I will find my way out of here and I will build a life. That's what mobilized me. What I lost was love and support. What I gained was the ability to stand on my own 2 feet.
Wow. Now, how does a 17-year-old in a foreign country, no passport? I think I remember the story in your book about the cop that you met that was helpful for you initially, but then kind of disappeared. Even after that incident, how do you kind of retain that hope and like that vision that you're gonna make it?
Right. That has been sort of the underlying lesson throughout my book, which is the idea of knowing. Hopes and dreams are great. They're important. But knowing and expecting a better outcome is what really pulled me through those dark moments. Yes, I would sit in a corner and lick my wounds for a while, but then I would revisit the idea, the thought, the belief, and the knowing that someday I will have the life that I had envisioned. I just have to take the steps to get there.
Yeah. And I remember you mentioned you talked about your father too quite a bit in your book, which touched my heart because I have a 14-year-old daughter myself, and he said he was very successful, very intellectual. The revolution kind of changed everything, made everything very unsafe, and but you gained a lot of lessons from him, how he conducted business and how he
Right.
treated his employees, and did you get kind of that mindset as well from him and that expectation of kind of success and succeeding?
Yes, and to treat people with regard, and with genuine care. One of the lessons that I do share in the book, and it sounds like a small lesson, but really set me up throughout life, was when I was our schools changed, we transitioned into a different school, but I'm not going to belabor that point. The idea was I wasn't doing well academically, even though I had been a very good student up to that point. And I gave it a try for a couple of weeks, and then I went to my dad and I said, I don't think I can do it. And he said, well, it's up to you, Shirin, but nobody in that classroom is any more competent than you are. And that's when the light bulb went on. That's when I started to learn sometimes problems present themselves and we think we're thinking we're dealing with one problem, but in reality, oftentimes you have to change your perspective to redefine the problem. So I thought maybe the problem isn't that I'm not good at this or academically, maybe I just haven't been exposed to what the rest of the students had been exposed. I applied myself, I got the best grades, lesson learned. I've applied that later on in life multiple times, even as CEO, even as going through a Great Recession, even as I was dealing with my life-threatening illness. Every time the question was, okay, well, here's the problem. Is my perspective right?
Yeah, it's interesting at the very end of your book too. You talk about award you're getting. I assume it's a franchise award or an executive award. And your son asked you, Mom, when you were working at that gas station, did you ever think that you'd be here? And you just answered, yes, I did. And
Yes.
I thought that was amazing because we have a lot of entrepreneurs and investors that are listening, and part of that mindset is when you invest or you start a business. You have this dream, you have this vision of succeeding, and there's so many road bumps on the road towards that vision. But you held that vision for like over 30 years when there's so many speed bumps. And how do you continue to train that muscle? Like you had the spark at the beginning, but after all of those moments, how did you continue to train that muscle?
The idea of someday running a big company is an idea that came to me when I was a cashier at a gas station behind bulletproof glass with the name Shirin Behzadi with no money and no parents. In fact, funny thing is that as you probably read in the book, I printed some business cards
Yes.
as a cashier, at a gas station. The business card that wasn't about the cashier, I was a CEO. So in my psyche, in the way I approached life was I was going to build a big business. I was going to be running a big business. I used to say back then General Motors was a thing. It was like not General Motors, but something big. So the question is, how did you keep it up? How did you continue to do it? It was first of all, the road from where you think you're going to go to where you go is definitely zigzaggy. Nobody could have predicted, including me, at the time that someday I would run a franchise business that would be doing this, and no. But I knew someday I had it in me to run a big business. So when those bumps in the roads, those hurdles showed up, I knew that I was going to make it to where I wanted to go. I just had to take the necessary steps. It just continued. I continued looking at that North Star and really believing that was going to happen. These are just hurdles in the way. In fact, I don't think I would have been able to reach and achieve. And by the way, that award is the Entrepreneur of the Year award behind me.
Oh.
I don't think I could have done any of that. We couldn't have built what we ended up building if it weren't for those hurdles. I say adversity is your superpower. Every growth that has happened to me, and I bet to many listeners, including yourself, if you really reflect, real growth comes after a big challenge. Adversity is what makes you better at what you do. So professionally and personally, I use those moments to grow through and from. I didn't use them to succumb and say, I'm not going to do it.
Yeah. It's like you came to America and then you worked at the gas station. You had to wear there's bulletproof glass. It was a dangerous neighborhood, in LA, I believe, right?
Right.
And so I remember in the book you're saying, well, I got through all this stuff in the revolution in my home country, going to Turkey. Someone comes up and robs me or something. I can be okay. I have my past as teaching me these lessons. So how did you walk me through how you kind of went from that to, you became an intern at Ernst & Young and then you worked at Ernst & Young. So walk me through that transition, how you got there.
Yes, Ernst Young EY has been very interesting in my life. We've in and out of each other's lives quite a bit
Yeah.
in a positive way. I was going to a state school and I was working full time at a gas station to
Hmm.
survive. And I remember thinking, well, if I'm going to run a big business someday, I'm going to learn its language, which is accounting.
Yep.
So, and of course, as I was studying, I thought, well, if I'm going to someday run a big company, I want to opt in for, I want to aim high. I want to work for one of the big eight. Back then, there were the big eight. So somehow I learned that there are internship programs. I went to the career office and I asked the woman counselor there about this, and she said, you know what, Shireen, those kinds of companies don't really recruit from our school. It wasn't a very well known school for business. This is where I thought, okay, well, great. I can hear this woman out. Great. There's some good nuggets of advice, but I don't have to listen to her. So I didn't. I ended up applying and I received one of the 8 internship positions in the entire greater LA area, which is a feat. And it was because of that that when I graduated, I had offers from all of the big 8 accounting firms, and I ended up
Wow.
working at EY. The work at EY was rewarding. I learned so much. I loved it. It was intellectually stimulating. I was doing really, really well until I reached a point where I thought, okay, many more years of this would make me a really good auditor. But what about
Yeah.
running a big company?
I
Yes.
mean, which was surprising as I read through the book too. Part in one of the sections of the book, you said you really love spreadsheets. Actually, you love crunching numbers, getting into the weeds and the details. But if you want to get to that next step of an executive, you have to kind of put that aside and learn so many of the other things of a business that
Right.
you did learn, and we're going to get to those too. But that was impressive. Like that you were even it's almost like you have to start somewhere, and you started at accounting, the language of business, which is
Right.
often called learning how businesses work, and then moving forward from there. So, what kind of set you to say, "All right, Ernst Young is not my thing," and then, well, you went from that to a role which was not really common at the time of being kind of a well, how is it you call it, a CFO in
Offsite CFO. In
yes,
between, I left EY with a very heavy heart. It was very difficult. I mean, think about someone with my financial insecurity. Now I had a great job, great reputable company. What are you thinking leaving?
yeah,
But I just knew that I needed to learn more, to your point, about operations, sales, how to run an organization. So I left to actually work for one of the clients. It was open and we talked about it. It was a very good conversation I had with the partners in charge. And so I ended up at a client's that where I really was in charge of a loan servicing portfolio of $1 billion with. So I learned a lot about operations. And then when the position of CFO was opening up, our existing CFO was leaving, he suggested, Shireen, you should think about becoming a CFO here. I think you can do it. And at the time, a lot of people told me not to because it wasn't a direct line. There were other people seemingly ahead of me, but I did ask and I did receive it. I became the CFO there and I learned a lot about operations. We sold eventually that bank to a larger bank, which was again great experience, transactions, all of that. That was when I had a decision to make. Do I pursue another CFO position, which I could, because now I had been with EY, I had been with a really good, reputable organization, I had all this experience, or go out on my own? So I chose to go out on my own because, again, I wanted to try my entrepreneurial muscles. And that's where I became what today we call them fractional CFOs. We didn't have the
yeah.
language for it then. I think I called it offsite CFO. And so it was through that journey that I ended up meeting the company that I stayed at for 20 years.
And that's a big risk because at the time that wasn't something that's as common as like you said today. So you're stepping away from Ernst and Young, going into this role where you're starting your own practice essentially, and you have to get clients. It's all about building
Yes.
your client base and developing that. And you took the risk.
Yes, yes. It was puzzling. Like, how do you do it? How do you step into something that you don't have anybody really that you know that you can emulate? There are no roadmaps. Like, how do you figure it out? Well, you figure it out by using principles that I've shared in this book. Part of the reason I wrote the book was because people ask me, what are those principles that got you from gas station cashier to $1 billion CEO? So for 2 years, I sat in the corner of the family room and I wrote. It took me 2 years because I kept reflecting. I kept asking myself, what are those principles that I didn't create, but I observed and learned? How do I share those? So some of those principles are exactly this, that because I had a very specific North Star in mind, my road to that became more and more apparent. It gave me a chance to say no to opportunities that didn't fit it.
Yeah.
Which is a big deal. Saying no is very important.
Yeah. Taking a big step like that, a risk, whether it be, opening up a new business. For many of our listeners, they're investors, so they invest in stocks. So opening up a new investment in a stock or career loss, failed businesses, any kind of these big life moments and changes, so much. Another great phrase, there's so many quotes in your book that I love. You said trauma is your history, it's not your destiny. So many of the choices we make sometimes are dictated by our own traumas and our own insecurities and fears. What advice would you give to those, whether it be, starting a new business, investing in something new, or recovering from like a failed business or career loss?
Right.
What would you say is like when they're in the middle of that, how to kind of reframe it from a loss to kind of an opportunity?
Much like a lot of your listeners, I've been in the position of investing my own money in other businesses in the market. I've had the seemingly challenge of failures from time to time. It hasn't been an easy road by any stretch. But I think what I do say in the book, which is what you said, whether it's your trauma or your circumstance, they don't dictate where you end up. Fear is your friend. Fear is a signaling mechanism to say, watch out. It doesn't mean don't do something. It just means consider the circumstances, observe what's in front of you, and choose to still do it. So taking steps even while you are fearful of something is quite appropriate if this is something you really do want to do. In my life, in all of the twists and turns that have happened in my life, that happens in people's lives in general, those bumps in the road had shown up. And those bumps in the road were often opportunities to pause, observe, and ask myself the question of, am I on the right path? Am I taking the correct steps? And then move forward. One of the quotes that you say you like the quotes in my book. There's one of the quotes that a lot of people have liked is you heal by moving. Because when you're in a dire situation, you do have to, of course, take the time and maybe be in a fetal position for a couple of minutes or a couple of days, but eventually you heal by moving, which is what I ended up doing throughout my life in all of these different positions and situations.
Yeah. Amazing. So let's fast forward to now when you actually finally become a CEO. You got that vision, you had the vision, you become a CEO, you walk into a role with high pressure, private equity partners. You
Yes.
kind of worked on sales and transactions before, so you have a kind of an idea about that. But now, the standard CEO playbook is a lot different when you have private equity in there. They're there
Yes.
to make money and get out at some point. So, lots of spreadsheets, lots of top-down, like deep analysis, which you knew how to do, but you kind of like took another step where you said you went on a listening tour, as you called it.
Yes.
Yes. You went and met with franchisees, stakeholders, partners, everybody you could, to kind of really listen to what they were saying, so you can take appropriate strategies. And I think that's a real key of how you led as a CEO too. So I'd love for you to tell us more about that.
Yes. So when we had been growing the company together, so we were an entrepreneur company. We took us a few years to land on what I call the secret sauce to grow. So it was a very hard first few years of being together. And when we started growing, we were able to see some really good results. We ended up adding yet another brand. The Great Recession hit. We went through a lot. So around 2013, we had seen a good trajectory, and it was obvious, as it happens in entrepreneurial companies, that really some of us were ready to move on. So with that in mind, I ended up pursuing private equity. I went out there to find out. I had been in the world of finance, but private equity was different. So it took me a couple of years, and this is where EY comes back in because I ended up
Yeah.
choosing them to partner with, but not as private equity, but to help us with the transaction. So eventually we ended up with the right private equity partners. And what I didn't know at the time is that a very small number of a percentage of companies backed by private equity are run by women. In fact, it's sub 2% apparently. But I didn't know that, but it's okay. It doesn't matter. I believed in our company. I believed that we had a lot of opportunity for growth. We just needed to find a way to help people that wanted to move on, move on. And so we were successful at recruiting private equity. Of course, what they agreed to do was to buy everybody else out, except that I would have to stay and run to the expectations that we had set forth in our SIM. So imagine we finished our private equity transaction. We are a franchise system with lots of franchisees, and we had to break the news to them that as of the transaction date, I would be the CEO, CIO, CFO, COO, and CMO in one person. And by the way, don't worry about it. We're going to be entrepreneurial. We're going to continue to grow. So you would think in that environment, and to your point, with the expectations, rightfully so, that private equity has, which are reporting and numbers, you would think that my focus would be, let's just generate more income, generate more sales. But it was no. I had known this company. I had grown it. I had grown up with it. And I knew that it was time for us to really, really hone in as to our messaging, our voice, who are we, and where are we headed, and make sure we're all aligned. That is why we did the listening tour. We did the listening tour to our employees and teams. And by the way, we made sure it's not just the executive team, not just the board, but truly teams that are on the front lines, because we were eager to hear from them exactly where opportunities lied, where we may be having some blind spots, but we learned a lot. And in that exercise, we also learned where the gaps lied between the different teams and their points of view. From there, we expanded it to our franchisees, stakeholders, and eventually to our customers. Accumulation of all of that information helped us better understand who we were at the time, and had everybody chime in to where we thought we were headed. And this one is very important, and I'll get back to that in a second. Also, have everybody really agree to who we wanted to become. Why those things are important is that because we engaged teams and franchisees and stakeholders, now they had literally stake in the game because they were a part of the solution. They were a part of where the vision was going to be. And of course, we have to communicate that over and over again effectively. Let's not dismiss that. The end result was, therefore, every person, while they were performing whatever they were performing, had their understanding of where we were headed, we wanted to become. And the end result was we changed everything. In fact, one of my board directors said, Shirin, you're changing the engine while driving 80 miles an hour. And I said, we absolutely are. We created the platform. We changed all ways of marketing, operations, technology, you name it, support. As a result, we saw double-digit growth top line, double-digit growth bottom line, month after month, year after year. We grew by 70% in 4 years in an industry that grew 6 to 9% a year. And we were of size, so those percentages were quite meaningful. We did all of that because we took the time to listen.
Yeah, in franchisees, in a franchisor system, you have the franchisor, the bigger entity, and you have franchisees who license or pay to use the brand name and everything. So many times in franchisor-franchisee relationships, there's a disconnect between the franchisees and the franchisors, and the franchisor kind of runs a ship, tells them what to do. Here's how you do your marketing. Here's how you do this. We have all the systems. You just execute. Franchisees do it, but their boots on the ground. Sometimes the execution doesn't happen the way one would envision, or the systems need upgrading. Marketing needs upgrading, which you talked a lot about in your book too. You had to completely revamp marketing because We went from traditional marketing to digital marketing within the time
Yes.
frame of your executive
Right.
leadership. So, you know, one thing I admire is that you place a lot of importance on the franchisees and their voice. So, what kinds of ideas did you get from them that you think helped your business, and did you implement some of those? And then, what kind of feedback were you getting from them in terms of how they felt that you were actually talking to them?
Yes. So, first of all, you have got to be aligned with your franchisees. Franchising is an interesting business because they're not necessarily your employees. Not necessarily. They're not your employees. They're also not completely independent. It's a partnership of sorts. Whereas as franchisor, however, you have to lead, you have to do a lot of good, understanding the market to help them. Done right, it's a very effective and powerful system because the loop back exists if you allow the loop back to exist. Franchisees are facing consumers. They understand consumer demand. They're dealing with them on a daily basis. Franchisor can look at patterns and overall approach and can accumulate all of that data and knowledge together for the benefit of the system as a whole. In order for this to work well, you have to be well aligned. And as franchisors, you have got to make sure you are very clear on one thing, which is what we said over and over again that was our North Star. We were there to making sure every franchisee is successful. That was what I thought our job was, and we believed our job was. Of course, the beauty of the industry that we were in was we also had to understand consumers, right? So as franchisors, you're still want to understand how do consumers want to consume, what products they like, what messaging they like. Bringing that collaboration to be effective between franchisee and franchisor allowed us to understand patterns and trends in the marketplace. This is why our marketing became so much more effective. To your point, social and digital marketing were relatively new. Of course, it accelerated very fast, and it was in collaboration with them that we could find out our best voice, best messaging, and best way to spread all of that to the consumers. And our franchises, of course, were local, so they could as well do some of the great local marketing work that they did.
And what was the impact of you used? You had to transition. You had a whole new marketing platform. You had to transition the franchisees onto that marketing platform. How were you able to amass the education and the adoption of those platforms so that everyone can be successful?
You have to make sure whatever you present has great value, meaning that you can't dictate to people to sign up for something that's not beneficial to them. So you have to have clarity around what the benefits are, why it makes sense to franchisees to use, and you have to design them with their success in mind. That has to be the guiding principle in creating any kind of a platform that you want franchisees to use, to adopt, to use effectively.
Yeah, yeah. I want to go back to the Great Recession because, you wrote for the first time in history, the company was going backward. You've been succeeding, you've been doing very well for a while, and then the recession hits, a home services franchise, mind you. Franchisees start, failing, a lot of fear and panic in the system, the economy, everywhere, When we own stocks, it's like we have a hold 'em or fold 'em moment. Like, do we want to, double up on the company because we know it can turn around and succeed, or do we want to just fold it or sell it and get out?
Right. Yes.
Describe how you got through that recession for a
Yes.
home services company.
Well, if you were a betting man, you wouldn't bet on a company that was built on home improvement during the Great Recession.
Yeah.
That was housing led. Do you remember all those foreclosure signs?
Oh yeah.
Imagine being in the seat that we were in, which is home improvement. Who's going to improve their home if they're losing their homes or their mortgages are upside down? The bottom dropped really rapidly, if you recall. And in our case, definitely very rapidly. We were for sure losing business. And so, of course, it was panic time at first, as it's normal. Then we had to say, okay, we're here to make sure that one, our franchisees stay in business, and we continue to bring products and services to our customers. Those are our jobs. So how do we get there? We had to have the courage to really redefine our product offering, our marketing, every which way we presented ourselves to the market. That takes courage, because if you've had some success, to sit back and say, well, no sacred cows, what do we need to change here? That's not easy. But we did. So we asked ourselves this question: who is the customer that's still out there? And what are they now buying? And we realized, well, of course, probably not very large home improvement opportunities, but are there smaller ones? Because people are staying in their homes now. Are they looking into improving some things for the ones that are staying? And how do we find them? So we changed our marketing. We changed our approach that from a sort of a broader brand marketing to more direct response. We went back to our suppliers and said, in order for all of us to win, we've got to redefine our products and programs, warranties. How can we work together, and pricing? How do we work together to bring the products that some of the consumers at least can afford and would like? So revamped all of that, revamped all of our supply relationships. And also, of course, our support had to change, right? We had to be more in the way of financially support, not financial support in the sense of giving them anything, but financial education. How do we get franchisees to better understand their own approach? How do we make sure they close more deals? All of those factors combined slowed down the loss that we had quite a bit. And therefore, the pie of home improvement had shrunk, but we became a bigger part of that pie because others didn't stay in business. What that meant was, as recovery happened and the pie started getting bigger, that's when we saw a great growth trajectory for ourselves.
Yeah. And as a investor myself, and for our listeners, one of the things when we analyze businesses is, and you mentioned that in your book with your franchise as well, was pricing. Pricing is a very tricky and interesting thing because, you think lower prices, more people will buy. Increased prices, people won't buy. That's not always the case. So how did you approach pricing?
You're so right. Early on, one of the best changes we made was to increase pricing. Mm-hmm. And I'm talking about the investment in our franchise system, because people oftentimes associate value with price in the sense that if you're too low in the way of price, they don't perceive you as valuable. So that's a funny thing about pricing. You've got to make sure you pricing it at a level that reflects who you are. So pricing also goes back to really understanding what it is that you offer. Why are people buying your products or services? Who are you? Therefore, once you have all of that defined, you have a better chance of pricing yourself correctly in the marketplace. If you are, in our case, we wanted to be solution providers, custom solution providers, but we wanted to appeal to more of a mass market. That already made it clear to us that we weren't going to price our products very high, but we certainly weren't going to price them low. We were middle of the road because of our custom approach to life. You just have to know who you are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, another thing you wrote in your book, which is I've heard also often, being CEO is a pretty lonely place.
Yes.
Early, you had the magazine, you were in Forbes, you had the awards, and you had a lot of employees leaning on you, and you often define leadership as shouldering and holding kind of the system's anxiety, because
Yes.
Not only that, but you had all the multiple C-level roles that you had to fill. So kind of what held that anxiety for you? How did you prevent that pressure from kind of suffocating you and not letting that stress turn into fear-based decisions?
Very good question. CEO is a lonely place because your executives, hopefully you have great teams and executives, but they're not necessarily your peers. They do look to you to make final decisions often. And your board is great, but again, they're there to make sure that you get your job done right. So as a CEO, you don't have really anybody. Since I've stepped down, I've very selectively advise some CEOs because I feel their pain.
Mm.
And when you're especially working on growing from one tier of success to a higher tier of success, that's a tough transition to make. In my case, I didn't have one. The good news and the bad news is that growing up, I really didn't have a single mentor because nobody really was somebody that I thought, well, they had the similar life experiences. We could understand each other. But there are bits and pieces of people that I utilized. There were people here and there. There was different kinds of advice that I took advantage of to help myself grow. In my role as CEO, I did the same. Plus, I took the time to reflect. I'm sure you read in my book that in the mornings, oftentimes I would sometimes pull on the side of the road and start making notes and reflect on what's going on internally with, my plans for the day, and listen, I meditated. All of those things were important because when it gets really fast moving sometimes with decisions and things are coming at you, you have to have the wherewithal to calm down, slow down, and analyze the situation. Those practices helped me with that.
Which I find that very interesting that you mentioned that too, because as I'm reading the book and I'm learning about your story, even since childhood through your life was at a fast pace. Like
Yes.
there's constantly something, whether it be health challenges, whether it be career challenges, whether it be anything else. You're always at a fast pace, and if you're gonna get to that level, it's gonna happen. But the thing that got you through it, as you're saying, is to actually take those times to slow down, breathe, calm down, and then reflect to kind of let your mind process it all. Otherwise, no
Yes.
mind can last that long or that
Also,
fast.
you become knee jerky, and that's not a good way to go. You've
Yeah.
got to be really thoughtful about your decisions, especially when you're making decisions for a lot of people. You've got to make sure that you really take the time. You're right. My life was very fast paced until it wasn't. When I had
Hmm.
my near death experience with my life threatening illness, and
Hmm.
I slowed down only because I had to.
Yeah.
And that was a really good teacher, very good teacher in life. Because I couldn't really walk and I had to learn to walk one step at a time, literally was the way I did it. And also I observed because I couldn't speak really well. I was
Hmm.
very sick. So between those two, I learned that listening and observing allowed me to understand my environment, people, and situations better. Once I recovered, I became so much more in tune with all of that. So it
Yeah.
really helped me get into the practice of slow down, observe, assess the situation before you move on.
Yeah. What is it? There's the body keeps score. So after
Yes.
all the challenge of all everything that happened, the body kind of
Right.
takes a physical mental toll with that, and it could be whether it be you're a CEO of a company or whether you could be managing your own personal finances for your family. You had
Sure.
you had said in your book, I chose to be the CEO of my own life. It's almost like you were prepping to be a CEO your whole life because you had to take charge of every decision, everything that was going on, no matter the challenges or the opportunities. So that was quite amazing how you did that. The other thing that one thing that I was excited about taking this interview too is you like the classic, not even the classic. You're a very unique immigrant story too. I'm an immigrant. My parents are immigrants, and so I appreciate that challenge. But you're also a woman, and you also
Yes.
talked about how when you're in the private equity room or when you're at Ernst and Young, you weren't the typical employee that was there, So that's kind of maybe where you get the unexpected CEO kind of title from. So like we talk a lot about when we look at companies and moats and competitive advantages. So did you see yourself like considering like people might think of you as an outsider. Did you see that as kind of a competitive advantage? Did you see that as a way that you can see things differently than how others could?
Yes, I first of all, I never worried about what other people thought I was different in any way, shape, or form. Being
Mm-hmm.
that with my name that was different, where I had grown up was different, you know, being a woman, none of that. I didn't worry about what other people thought. What I focused on was the motto that I have in life, which is doing well by doing good. And by doing good mean good work, good by others, being a good member of a team, good citizen of the world. With between all of those, I believe that if I were to focus on my merit and really hone in on what I do well without regard to what other people say, because what other people think of me is really none of my business. What I think of me matters. And so I stayed focused on that. It was because of that that I was able to find my way into those rooms and at those tables that one usually wouldn't think somebody like me would end up at, right? The unexpected is absolutely reference to that, because really, if you think about and reflect back of the girl sitting alone at a gas station behind bulletproof glass, that is not a person you'd say someday is going to run a big company. It's just not something you would normally think of. But my answer to that is this: why not? You know, when people said 1.8% of companies backed by private equity are run by women, I'm like, well, there's 1.8%. And sure enough, after our transaction, we were on their homepage for 3 years after the transaction was complete because we were so successful. So the point of it is, the world oftentimes, regardless of where we come from, by the way, or what our background is, oftentimes the world wants to tell you what you can't. You know, whether it's people, it's their limitations. If that's the woman in the career office counselor telling me, and you know, in college, don't apply for an internship, you won't get it. It's their limitations, their fears, where they see themselves or the world, whether it's society, whether it's culture, whatever those things are. My advice to people is tune them out. Tune them out. None of your business. Do your thing. Because we all have, and I oftentimes encourage people to take an inventory of your strengths. Sit down and write them. Because I bet you know what you're not good at because the world tells you. But have you taken the time to reflect on what you are good at? And, you know, then that would become your foundation based on which you can continue to build. So my answer is yes, I'm in the fringes seemingly in many ways, but in reality is I'm not. When I wrote this book, I'm a first-time author, and I literally wrote it myself. When I was finished, people said, well, publishers nowadays don't publish if you're not a celebrity. And I'm like, okay, well, let's see about that. I submitted on a Wednesday, and I have a fantastic publisher, great partners. By Friday, I've been on the NASDAQ tower, and this book is a national bestseller, ended up at number 7 overall and number 2 in business, only second to a book published by McKinsey. So not true. What you choose, what you believe you can bring to the world is what you bring to the world. It doesn't matter what other people think.
Yeah. So I have a slight challenge question for you. You know, you what I was also very impressed by was that, you know, you did all these things by doing good and being like a good, like taking the right path, the good path. Often, sometimes people say, well, Shirin, you're crazy. Like, all these CEOs, they get there because they, you know, ruffle some feathers or they cheat the system or they have special privileges. So what would you say to some of those people that say, no, I don't think you can just be good and succeed. You have to, you know, go in the gray.
Yes. First of all, by good, I don't mean goody two shoes.
Yes,
Right?
of course.
I don't mean a pushover.
Yes.
When we talk about empathy, I'm not saying coddle everybody. I'm saying be smart about, let me start with empathy. I'm saying empathy means meeting people where they are. As a good leader, your job is making sure our people are in the right seats, have the right playbook so they know what they're doing, and measure them, and you harmonize them. That's your job, right? Who does that better? Somebody who can understand people and where they are, or somebody who doesn't? I suggest the person who can understand other people is better at leadership. That person is also better at negotiating, sitting across the table from someone, understanding what win looks like for them. So I think this notion that you've got to be necessarily a harsh backstabber to make it, first of all, I don't believe that it is true. One, I've met many leaders. This may be a lot of sort of clickbait reputational thing that we hear about people. That's not necessarily true. I've met a lot of CEOs, consulted with a lot of CEOs, and I've seen many people that really do prescribe to the idea of making sure their teams are in the right place, their executive teams are growing appropriately, all of that. And those to me are doing good. And then if there are some here and there that by their approach, which may not be an approach that I like, still see some financial success, good for them. There are different approaches to life. My question is, how is their life holistically? How are they approaching everything in their world? Because we are so keen on saying work-life balance nowadays because we should, because we're also human beings. And one thing that I found as a reflection in my book is it's very human. And, the idea is you want to make sure that whatever you do in life, however you enjoy success, is that success also reflected in your personal life? And I think in my opinion, by doing good, you make sure both sides are covered.
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome. So, you sold the company in 2019, you double the value, achieve like the American dream by almost every metric. If you could kind of go back to that 17-year-old girl in the gas station booth, or any little girl that's, listening, questioning her abilities, trying to succeed, knowing everything you know about the costs, the loneliness, the illness, what would you say to her? Would you apologize for how hard it was and how hard you're going to push her, or would you thank her?
Oh, first of all, I want to say, you go, girl. Keep at it. Maybe if I were there now and this was my child, I would potentially at times say, own what you're doing, believe in what you're doing, because that would have made some of those tougher times not be so tough. So the idea of owning your own successes is something that I think maybe we should do more often. And by the way, I say the same to a little boy that may have difficult circumstances. I do say, if I were to talk to myself as a 17-year-old, I'm going to say, good job, you're courageous, keep it up, life is going to have twists and turns, but you're not defined by those twists and turns. You're going to get through them, you're going to build a life that you're going to be proud of, and the beauty of it is, what I'm doing today, you can use these lessons learned to impact and help others.
Yeah, amazing. So one final question now, after all the the talks and the interviews and everything with the book and the book stuff settles down, what's next for you?
Yes, exactly. Impact. So the writing of the book was not an ending. It was intended to be a beginning. And the idea is this: with messaging, with speaking, with more writing, with podcasts, exposures like this, really helping others understand principles that are at play so that they can. So I'm saying, because you can grow, build, accomplish, and live your vision. And that adversity that you meet along the way is your friend. It's your superpower. So I am going to be wholeheartedly doing my best to impact others' lives through the lessons that I've learned and principles I get to share.
That's amazing. That's awesome. So, your story is a reminder that, we're not defined by where we start, but kind of the vision we refuse to let go of. So, the book is Unexpected CEO. Everyone pick up a copy, read it. I highly recommend it. Thanks for joining us today and sharing your amazing story.
Thank you. Yes, the Unexpected CEO. Thanks for having me.
Full on.